Maya had heard the stories of the Red House her whole life. Everyone in her small New England town knew of the crumbling red brick mansion nestled at the end of Ridgeway Road. For years it was empty, standing in eerie solitude among thick, twisted trees. They said it belonged to the Ward family, who had vanished overnight one cold winter decades ago, leaving behind a fully furnished house, dinner plates set, candles burned down to wax puddles, chairs tipped over. Only their dog had remained, pacing the halls, howling at every window. Maya's friends had dared her to go inside that night. Her life was a series of quiet days spent between work at the library and empty nights in her tiny apartment. She longed for something different, something thrilling. The Red House seemed like the perfect place. "Come on, Maya. Just 15 minutes," Lisa coaxed as they parked outside the iron gate. "You wanted an adventure, right?" Maya's stomach tightened as she looked at the house. Its blackened windows seemed like eyes watching her, judging her bravery. "You're coming in with me, though," she said. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, of course. In and out." With flashlights in hand, they squeezed through the rusted gate, its hinges whining like a wounded animal. The house loomed closer, taller and darker, each step making it feel more alive. Maya reached the front door, and to her surprise, it wasn't locked. The handle was cold and heavy in her palm as she turned it slowly. The door groaned open, releasing a stale, damp scent into the night air. Inside, the house was silent, but the quiet seemed to hum, pressing against their ears. They shone their flashlights along the walls, which were covered in peeling wallpaper, damp and bubbling in spots. Cobwebs hung thick in the corners, draping from the ceiling like ghostly curtains. "Just the entryway," Lisa whispered, clutching Maya's arm. "Then we're out." But Maya was already stepping deeper into the darkness. The air felt denser, colder. Her breath fogged in front of her, though it was a mild autumn night. She tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that something was watching her, observing her every movement from the darkened rooms beyond. They wandered into what looked like a dining room. The long table was draped with a mold-stained cloth set with tarnished silverware, just as she'd heard in the stories. A single candle, melted down to the wick, was stuck in a brass holder, its hardened wax spilling over like dried blood. Chairs were scattered, as if abandoned in a hurry. Suddenly, a faint voice echoed from down the hall, low and ragged. "Who's there?" Maya's heart stopped. She turned to Lisa, who looked equally terrified. "Did you hear that?" Maya whispered, gripping her flashlight tighter. Lisa nodded, her face pale in the dim light. "Maybe. Maybe someone's living here. We should leave." But something in Maya pushed her forward, something more than curiosity, a dark, pressing urge to see more. She moved down the hall, her steps muffled on the dusty carpet. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening. She could feel Lisa trembling beside her, breathing quickly. The sound of footsteps echoed in the darkness ahead, followed by a soft, dragging sound. Maya felt her blood run cold. They turned a corner, and there, in the shadowy hall, stood a woman. She was gaunt, her skin a sickly gray, with hair matted and tangled around her face. She wore an old, tattered dress, the fabric hanging off her thin frame. Her eyes were hollow, staring directly at them without blinking. "Leave," she croaked, her voice strained, like she hadn't spoken in years. Lisa yelped, tugging on Maya's arm. "Let's go. Now." But Maya was frozen, staring into the woman's eyes, transfixed by the desperation in them. "Why are you here?" Maya whispered. The woman took a shuddering breath, her eyes flickering with something like recognition. They didn't leave me," she rasped. "I was here when they locked the doors." "What do you mean?" Maya asked, her voice shaking. "They were supposed to leave, but they left me in the walls." Her voice cracked, and she held up her hands, which were covered in deep, raw scratches. "I tried to get out, clawed and screamed, but no one came." Maya felt bile rise in her throat, the weight of the woman's words crushing down on her. She could feel Lisa pulling her back, but she couldn't look away from the woman's hollow, accusing stare. A loud bang echoed from behind them, breaking Maya from her trance. She turned, heart pounding, as footsteps thundered down the hall. "Run!" Lisa screamed, pulling Maya by the arm. They sprinted down the corridor, their flashlights flickering wildly. Behind them, the dragging footsteps grew louder, closer. Maya chanced to look back and saw the woman lurching toward them, her fingers clawing the air, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. They burst through the front door, stumbling down the steps and out into the cool night. The moment they crossed the threshold, the footsteps stopped. The house fell silent again, looming in the darkness like a crouched beast. Gasping for breath, they reached the gate, only to find it locked. It had swung shut silently behind them. No, no, no. Maya cried, yanking at the iron bars. She looked back, and in one of the upstairs windows, she saw a faint light. The woman was standing there, watching them with a sad, empty gaze. Maya's legs went weak. She could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears, but the world around her was deathly quiet. Just as they began to feel the walls closing in, the gate creaked, slowly swinging open on its own. Neither of them spoke as they stumbled through it, too afraid to look back. When they finally made it back to the car, Maya turned to Lisa, her voice barely a whisper. Did you hear what she said?" Lisa's face was pale, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She said she was locked in the walls. Maya swallowed, her mouth dry. But the Ward family, they left. They vanished. What if they never did? In the days that followed, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Sometimes, late at night, she heard faint scratching, like nails scraping along wood. And once, when she glanced at her reflection in her bathroom mirror, she thought she saw a face behind her, gaunt and hollow-eyed, lips moving as if whispering a single, desperate word. Stay. For the rest of her life, Maya never returned to the Red House. But every year when autumn rolled around, she would hear the faintest whisper in her dreams, and it always sounded like a woman, clawing and screaming, locked inside walls that no one could ever open. Late one foggy night, Logan found himself driving along a winding, unlit road through the woods. The GPS had cut out hours ago, and he hadn't seen another car since sunset. The clock on his dashboard blinked 3:17 a.m., and all he wanted was to get back to the motel he'd booked. The quiet of the road was almost suffocating. Even with his windows up, he felt the weight of silence pressing in. Just as he rounded a bend, he saw a shape in the middle of the road. A woman, barefoot, dressed in a thin white nightgown. Her long, tangled hair obscured her face, but she stood perfectly still, arms limp at her sides. Logan hit the brakes, his car skidding to a stop just inches away from her. Heart pounding, he rolled down his window. "Are you okay?" he called out. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. Her body swayed slightly in the wind, but she remained silent, her face hidden behind the veil of hair. Logan hesitated, his skin prickling. Everything about this felt wrong. He considered driving around her and leaving her there, but something about her stillness, her vulnerability, made him stay. He opened his door and stepped out into the cold night, keeping his distance. "Miss, do you need help?" he asked again. Slowly, her head tilted upward, and she looked at him. Her eyes were wide, impossibly wide, as though they'd seen horrors he couldn't imagine. Her lips parted, and in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she murmured, "It's coming." Logan's blood ran cold. "What's coming?" She lifted a bony finger, pointing to the woods behind her, dark and endless. "It follows me. I thought I'd lost it, but it's here." The air felt heavier, thick with something unnameable. Logan glanced past her into the darkness, but he saw nothing, just trees, stretching into the blackness. He swallowed, turning back to her. "Who's following you? I can call the police. Just get in the car, okay?" The woman shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "No one can help me." She took a step closer, her pale, dirt-smeared feet sinking into the gravel. But you shouldn't have stopped." Logan's heart pounded harder. "Why not?" "Because," she whispered, her voice trembling, "it knows you now. It'll never stop." Suddenly, the forest behind her came alive with a sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the ground beneath his feet. Logan whipped his head toward the sound, and for a split second, he caught sight of something moving between the trees, dark and massive, shifting in a way that defied logic, defied reason. His stomach clenched with a primal terror he hadn't felt since childhood. "Get back in the car!" he shouted, panic overtaking him as he scrambled back inside. But the woman remained where she was, watching him with that hollow, resigned look. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he tried to start the engine. The growling grew louder, closer, and he could swear he saw branches bending, snapping as the thing in the woods approached. His car finally roared to life, and he looked up just in time to see the woman standing at his window, her face pressed close to the glass, her eyes wide and hollow. "Run," she said, her breath fogging up the window. Logan slammed on the gas, tires screeching as he tore down the road. In his rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of her standing in the middle of the road, the shadows from the trees swallowing her whole. He drove for what felt like hours, not daring to look back. Finally, he saw the lights of his motel ahead and pulled into the parking lot, his hands shaking as he clutched the steering wheel. His chest heaved, and he tried to steady his breath, telling himself it was over. He was safe. But then he noticed something strange. The parking lot was completely empty, though it had been full when he'd checked in that afternoon. The lights of the motel flickered, casting strange shadows across the ground. He glanced at the front office, but the inside was dark. Taking a deep breath, Logan stepped out of the car. The quiet was deafening, unnatural. His footsteps echoed as he approached his room, key in hand. But when he reached his door, he saw that it was already open, the doorknob hanging loosely. Swallowing his fear, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was just as he'd left it, except for one thing. On the bed, propped against the pillows, was a note written in spidery, looping handwriting. "It followed you." Logan's throat tightened. The note wasn't there when he left. He backed up, heart pounding, and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut in front of him. From the shadows of the room, a soft, shuffling sound grew louder. Logan turned, his eyes searching the dim light, and he saw it. The woman from the road, standing in the corner, her head tilted to one side, her eyes wide and glassy, filled with a sorrow so deep it made his chest ache. "It's here," she whispered, barely audible. "It came for you too." Before Logan could move, a chill seeped into the room, bringing with it a sense of dread so powerful that he staggered backward. The woman began to convulse, her body twisting and contorting as if pulled by invisible strings. Her jaw unhinged, stretching far wider than any human should be able to, and a hollow, rattling scream filled the air. The shadows around her grew darker, solidifying into a figure that loomed behind her, towering and skeletal, its face a twisted mask of rage and hunger. It reached out a bony hand, placing it on her shoulder, and as it did, her eyes met Logan's, filled with terror and pleading. "Run," she mouthed silently. But his legs wouldn't move. The creature turned its gaze on him, its empty eye sockets burning with an unnatural darkness. Logan felt an icy grip on his throat, his vision blurring as the room spun. Just before the world went black, he heard her voice once more, echoing in his mind. "It'll never let you go." It was midnight when Carmen's phone buzzed. She was in bed, halfway between sleep and wakefulness, but the chime pulled her from a pleasant drowsiness. She squinted at the screen, confused. It was a text from her little sister, Ellie. "Are you awake?" Carmen rubbed her eyes, puzzled. Ellie had moved to another city last year for college, and they didn't speak often this late. She texted back, "Yeah, what's up?" Immediately, her phone buzzed again. "Can you come pick me up?" Carmen frowned. She hadn't even known Ellie was in town. The thought of her little sister needing help on some dark street made her sit up, the last remnants of sleep clearing away. She quickly typed back, "Where are you?" There was a pause before the next message appeared. "I'm in the woods by the old school." Carmen's stomach twisted. The school was long abandoned, a crumbling building surrounded by a dense patch of forest. No one went there anymore, not even local kids. It was far from anywhere Ellie might logically be. She quickly called, but the line went straight to voicemail. Nervous, she texted again. "Ellie, why are you there?" Another pause. Then, "I just need you. Please." Something about the message sent a chill down Carmen's spine. The words didn't sound like Ellie. They were off somehow. But she couldn't ignore the plea for help. She threw on her coat, grabbed her car keys, and drove off into the night. The town was deserted at that hour, and the drive to the old school felt longer than she remembered. Trees crowded close to the road, their branches twisting into strange shapes, clawing at the moonlit sky. As she neared the entrance to the abandoned school grounds, she felt an inexplicable dread settle over her, heavy and oppressive. She parked at the edge of the forest, grabbed a flashlight, and started walking, the beam cutting through the dense trees. The air was cold and filled with a strange, damp smell, like rotting leaves. She turned her phone's flashlight on as well and tried calling Ellie again, but there was no answer. "Ellie?" she called, her voice swallowed by the darkness. The silence that answered was so complete it made her skin prickle. She felt watched, as if eyes were hidden in the trees, tracking her every step. She pushed the feeling aside and moved deeper into the woods, following the rough trail leading toward the school. Finally, she saw a figure ahead, standing still among the trees, partially hidden in the shadows. "Ellie," she called out again, relief mixing with fear. The figure didn't move. Carmen's flashlight beam swept over it, illuminating her sister's familiar shape, the dark jacket, long hair. But Ellie's head was tilted downward, face hidden beneath a curtain of hair. "Ellie, what's wrong?" Carmen asked, stepping closer. Ellie lifted her head slowly, and Carmen felt her heart stop. The face staring back at her was familiar, yet horribly wrong. Ellie's eyes were wide, too wide, bulging as if forced open. Her mouth hung slack, lips stretched into a strange, vacant smile. Her skin looked pale and tight, as if it barely fit over her bones. "Carmen," Ellie's voice came out soft, almost sing-song. "You shouldn't have come here." Carmen's stomach twisted with a primal fear. She took a shaky step backward, feeling her pulse hammering in her throat. "What? Ellie, are you okay?" she managed, her voice trembling. Ellie's head tilted to one side, her grin widening unnaturally. "I needed you here," she whispered, stepping forward. "I couldn't be alone." "Stop. Please, Ellie, you're scaring me." "Not Ellie," the figure whispered, its voice changing, flattening into something dry and lifeless. "But I needed you to come. I needed someone to stay." And then, before her eyes, Ellie's face began to change, her skin darkening, shifting as though something underneath was struggling to get out. Her smile grew impossibly wide, stretching her mouth until her skin split at the corners, revealing glistening teeth that didn't belong in any human mouth. Carmen stumbled backward, barely able to keep from screaming. She turned, desperate to run, but the moment she did, she heard a chorus of voices echoing through the trees, soft, raspy voices calling her name, repeating it over and over. "Carmen, Carmen." She broke into a run, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly in front of her. The forest around her seemed to close in, trees growing closer, branches reaching down like claws. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, and she could feel eyes watching her from every direction. The voices grew louder, overlapping into a horrible, discordant sound that filled her ears. Finally, she burst from the tree line, the sight of her car a lifeline. She threw herself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it, her hands shaking as she started the engine. She took one last look back at the trees, and her heart stopped. Ellie's figure stood at the edge of the woods, staring at her. Her face was hidden in shadow, but she was smiling that same wide, vacant grin. Carmen stomped on the gas, speeding down the road. She didn't look back again, not even when she heard the faint sound of laughter echoing behind her. When she finally made it home, Carmen's phone buzzed again. She hesitated, dread curling in her stomach, but she picked it up, heart pounding. Another text from Ellie had appeared. "Thanks for coming. I'm almost home now." Her hands shook as she texted back. "What do you mean? I just saw you in the woods." A reply came instantly. "What? I've been driving home all night. I texted you earlier to say I'd be back in town by morning." Carmen's blood ran cold as she realized she hadn't spoken to her sister at all. Whatever that thing in the woods had been, it had lured her there, pretending to be Ellie, speaking in her voice. And then, as she sat frozen, staring at her phone, the final message came through. "I'm still waiting, Carmen. Come back." She dropped her phone and slammed it face down on her bed, heart racing. But no matter how hard she tried to forget, she would always remember that wide, unnatural grin in the shadows and the voice that echoed in her mind, endlessly repeating, "Come back, come back, come back." The night was dead quiet as Mark descended into his basement. It was just supposed to be a routine check. The light bulbs down there had been flickering for weeks, and he finally couldn't take it anymore. The air was cold, damp, and carried a faint, musty smell that hadn't been there before. He never liked the basement, even as a kid. There was something about it that felt wrong, like he was intruding on someone else's space. Tonight, though, something felt different. His skin prickled as he reached the bottom of the stairs, a heavy silence pressing against his ears. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling buzzed overhead, throwing weak light over stacks of old boxes, some covered with tarps, others tipped over with their contents spilling out. He stepped over a crate, shining his flashlight over the far wall, and there, his stomach twisted. Someone had written words on the wall, scrawled in jagged, frantic handwriting. "Help me." The writing was faint, a dull reddish-brown color, and there was something deeply unsettling about it. Mark took a shaky step back, suddenly feeling the weight of the air in the basement pressing down on him. Must be some prank, he muttered, though his voice sounded hollow even to himself. The house had been empty for years before he moved in, and he couldn't imagine who could have left this here. As he examined the words, he heard something behind him, a soft, scraping noise like fingernails scratching against wood. He spun around, his flashlight beam darting wildly, but there was nothing there, only empty shadows. But then his eyes fell on something lying just a few feet away. It was a small, weathered doll, slumped against the floor near the foot of the stairs. He didn't remember ever seeing it before. Its face was cracked, the painted eyes faded, and one of its arms was missing. It looked ancient, neglected, yet somehow out of place. Mark's heart pounded harder as he took a step toward it, drawn by a horrible, morbid curiosity. He picked up the doll, turning it over in his hands, and noticed a name stitched into its dress in tiny, uneven letters. Lily. As he whispered the name, the bulb above him flickered violently, and then everything went black. In the sudden darkness, he froze, his breath catching. The silence thickened around him, broken only by the faintest whisper that made his blood run cold. Lily. It was soft, barely audible, but it was there. He could feel a presence in the room, standing just behind him, close enough that he could feel the cold radiating off it. He held his breath, every nerve in his body screaming to run, but he couldn't move. The whisper came again, closer this time. Lily, come back. Shaking, he lifted his flashlight and turned it on, his hands trembling as the beam sliced through the darkness. His heart stopped as he saw a figure in the corner, partially obscured by shadows. It was a woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow and empty. She was dressed in a tattered nightgown, her arms hanging limp at her sides. Mark stumbled back, nearly tripping over a box. Who are you? He stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The woman's head tilted to one side, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that froze him in place. Have you seen Lily? She asked, her voice a hoarse, cracked whisper. I need to find her. She's lost. Mark's mouth went dry. I don't know who Lily is. The woman's eyes narrowed and her expression twisted with something like anger, mixed with despair. She was here, she whispered, her voice trembling. She was here, but she was taken from me. Mark took a step back, clutching the doll in his hand. Please, I don't know what you're talking about. The woman took a shuffling step forward, her feet dragging along the floor, her gaze never leaving his. She was my daughter, she said, her voice breaking. They took her from me, buried her down here, all alone. Mark's stomach churned as the full weight of her words sank in. He glanced down at the doll in his hands, the stitched name on its dress. The woman's eyes widened and she reached out a hand, her fingers gnarled and thin, pointing at the doll. You have her. Give her back to me. Mark's grip tightened instinctively, his mind racing. This doll? This isn't her. It's just a doll. The woman's expression darkened, her lips pulling back in a snarl. Give her back. Terrified, Mark threw the doll onto the floor, and it landed with a hollow thud, spinning until it stopped, its cracked face staring up at him. The woman's eyes gleamed with something feral as she stepped forward, bending down to pick up the doll. But as her fingers brushed its worn fabric, her head snapped up to look at him, and her mouth stretched into a grin too wide, too unnatural to be human. Her voice dropped, cold and menacing. You took her from me. Before Mark could scream, the basement light flickered back on, illuminating the room. He blinked, his heart racing, and looked around. The woman was gone. The doll lay abandoned on the floor, as though nothing had happened. But something felt wrong. The air was different, thick with a lingering darkness that hadn't been there before. He ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind him, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breathing. For days afterward, he tried to convince himself it was a dream, a trick of his imagination. But the doll remained where he'd left it, and no matter what he tried, he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. He shoved it into an old box, sealed it with tape, and shoved it into a closet. But every night after that, he would hear faint whispers through the walls. A woman's voice, soft and broken, calling out to him in the dark. Lily? No matter where he went in the house, he could hear her. And sometimes, just as he was about to fall asleep, he'd feel the icy brush of a hand against his cheek, and her voice, close enough to feel her breath. You can't keep her from me, forever. And when he finally mustered the courage to open the closet one night, hoping to end the haunting once and for all, He found the box ripped open, the doll gone, and a single word scrawled across the inside of the closet door: found.